All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. As we get ready for the imminent release of Rebellion Without Rehearsal, I wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting on the competitive season we've just left. So much of this video is going to be going through all of the different kind of major shifts in the meta and some of the biggest tournaments that happened in the 2023 season, and how those led me to ultimately conclude that this has been the best Netrunner meta since at least 2014. Now, admittedly, I wasn't playing hyper competitively in all of the years between 2014 and the present, but I think the 2023 the Automata Initiative meta has had some pretty astounding properties that, to be honest, I don't expect to be consistently replicated, but I think should be celebrated and talked about. So what kind of leads me to saying that the Automata Initiative might, for me, and I think for a good chunk of people, has been the best meta of the recent memory? Well, there's a couple of things that go into that. I think some of these are kind of a high-level conceptual thing. One, basically every faction had multiple archetypes that could consistently top 8. Depending on how you crunch the numbers, you maybe have 6 out of the 7 factions that had multiple archetypes that finished in the top 8 across different events this season. And not just as one-offs, but often to the point where they were major meta considerations for the events that would follow. This is one that it's probably going to be a little bit difficult to figure out, but it doesn't seem like there was a clear tier 0 set of decks. And what was to qualify, and by tier 0, I mean just like a deck that you should play and it almost doesn't matter what your opponent brings to the table. And there wasn't even like a clear best deck for every side. Every time there was an event where someone said, oh yeah, I figured out the best deck, by the next event, someone had figured out ways to beat it. And, that's not everyone's cup of tea. Some people do want matchups that are really tight, but like really defined to the 2014 meta was actually one of those where it was like, oh, there's probably about 4 decks you should be playing, but they have really interesting matchups against each other. And I think one of the very fun and interesting things about the Automata Initiative kind of meta game was that there was probably a dozen different decks that had to be considered and thought about. And to me, that's one of the fantasies of why you would play a card game, especially one like Netrunner, where you can build any deck you want at any week for no cost, right? And I think one of the cool things about this is also that because the decks were so varied, what people were good at playing was often more important than just being able to play the right style of deck. And conversely, building correctly was still rewarding. You couldn't just grab any random pile and do well. You had to make considerations to what you thought the meta was going to be. And if you could call the meta correctly, you could get huge rewards. And then I think another thing that someone pointed out to me as I was working on the script for this video was that testing groups and individuals really changed in 2023 than how they had functioned in 2022 and 2021 and 2020, where there was, in those years, it was a small group of people. There would be kind of, I would almost call them individual innovators, but then kind of there was a small clique of testing groups that would do lots of innovation, refining, consistently would do well at some of the major events. This year, the number of groups and individuals that contributed to shifting and shaping the meta was way wider, and some of the old mainstays, while they still did really good work, were less pivotal in shaping and pushing the meta. So, I think that these are kind of all really good things when you step back and say, what do we want? Now, I know that some people didn't love the Automata Initiative meta, but to me, I think it is pretty difficult to contest that this has been one of the best metas that people can be going into. And so I want to break down, I think, some of the factors that led into this before I go into what actually happened this season. So the first thing, and this is just what rotation took out. Now, there's a long video I did actually right before the Automata Initiative came out that I'm going to link below, where I go into these in more details. But basically, the bin breakers going, I think, is one of the most important things for the meta, just for slowing the game down and giving Corpse a little bit of room to breathe. Hard-hitting news, CTM and Boom going was a big deal. Stock buyback, I think, actually being gone made a huge difference in this meta. Misdirection, Fairchild 3, DNA Tracker, APOC are all big ones. I think Global Food Initiative, I almost want to make a little mini video just on how big Global Food Initiative going was. But I think, honestly, rotation did a ton to kind of fix the game in a lot of ways. There was just a sort of warping and changing of the action and baseline economy of Netrunner, and Flashpoint going kind of brought a lot of that balance back. But I think that is underselling a little bit what NSG did with the Liberation cycle. And I think what's really interesting is it's not like every single faction got a bunch of out-of-the-park cards. You know, Criminal arguably got 2 cards in terms of the competitive meta for the entire set with Hermes and Kurapira. But I think the really interesting thing was that Hermes enabled the kind of very control-oriented Criminal that had really fallen out of the meta to suddenly become a huge meta force, and one that we'll talk about later in this video repeatedly. And then we also saw Anarch, which was a faction that, you know, had been generically the best and continues to probably, like, I think undeniably be the most consistent faction throughout the year. Instead of getting like core pieces, they mostly got an entirely separate engine. Now that engine ended up being really cool and powerful, but their like kind of reg Anarch support was pretty limited in this set. I think Shaper got a really cool shot in the arm. Arasana, I think, has been one that a lot of players really enjoyed, and, you know, pulled some cards out of the binder. I think Pisha Sao ended up being a kind of standout card for Shapers, which I think is a great place for something like that to have ended up. And, you know, while maybe my favorite version of Arasana engine deck didn't quite cut the mustard, I think we saw some really good reg Shaper performance, and we saw Extract, as we'll talk about later in the video, doing some really good stuff with Arasana. HB was already the best and really didn't get a lot, but some of the cards it got, I think, are really impactful. NBN, you know, it lost a lot in rotation, but I think Oppo, Behold, Federal Fundraising, and VSA kind of really shifted it kept a lot of the core ideas and fundamentals behind NBN. Jinteki did not get as much, at least competitively, and this is probably the faction that suffered the most from the Automata Initiative, though Your Digital Life ended up being a huge card for Jinteki for reasons that will become clearer. And I think Wayland actually had one of its best years, I would argue, basically off the back of Tucana, Valentau, and Slash and Burn. I think these cards propped up, or basically created or forced, you know, a rush Wayland, not from sort of a consideration to basically one of the best decks you should be thinking about at all times. And so, you know, the NSG release for the Automata Initiative tried to not give already strong things more tools for that, and instead take the things that were kind of at the lower tiers and give them tools to support, and then give kind of Anarch and HB more kind of tangential tools to what they're already good at. Now, that doesn't mean that all that many of the Automata Initiative cards saw play, but I think the way that these cards work together happened to create this pretty astounding and amazing meta. And so in the back half of this video, actually the majority of this video, I'm going to be running down kind of quickly what the competitive season looked like for the Automata Initiative. So the Automata Initiative was released in July of 2023, and within a week, the first Continentals happened. This is unusual. This was a thing that, you know, hopefully will not be repeated, in all honesty, even though I thought it ended up leading to some really cool results. It meant that, you know, we had 65 new cards, and the first Continentals had less than a week to tune or innovate on ideas. And so most of what we saw in this very first Continentals was kind of what was good in the previous meta, or what had been hurt the least by rotation. I think people were also really, really excited about Hermes. And so when we look at the breakdown of IDs, it was 20% 419, 20% Hoshiko. Hoshiko was the clear best runner before the cycle was released. 419 was not really on the radar before, but Hermes seemed like a great tool for 419. Then there was another 13% Freedom, 10% Ari, but the cut was 6 Hoshikos, 1 Arasana, and 1 Tau. So there's some interesting things that happened there. a lot of 419s showed up, and none of them were able to convert. A little bit of Shaper, a little bit of Dow were able to convert. The Dow was on Hermes, and the Hoshikos were pretty much reg Hoshikos. Some of them were on Ma, some of them were on Hermes. There was often like Boomerang and Bankar and just these kind of like, reg, normal kind of, I'm going to apply pressure. I'm going to use the twinning as my late game win condition. And I'm just going to out efficiency and out money use the corp. And that proved to be really effective. And I think shaped a lot of what people thought, like, that sort of was what people had the impression of was going to be the best. And so when we talk about the decks that they brought corp side, well, for the Swiss, it sounds like they picked the stuff that was correct to beat it. So they brought 20% outfit, 20% sports metal-ish, 10% R+, and then about 10% PD. With the idea that both outfit and sports metal were kind of these fast advanced decks that could ignore the hyper efficiency that runners were bringing to the table. Now, in practice, what happened was the R+ decks that only made up 10% of the meta made up almost half of the cut on their own. And I think this is really interesting. And this was, we're going to see R+ turn up a bunch throughout the event, throughout the season, and it's going to keep changing almost every time it turns up. So the event was won by Santa, who was playing a fast advanced outfit and a very reg Hosh. But the events that people were talking about upon this event finishing was this R+ deck that was called Sparrow Brawler that was very much like jam behind not very much ice, but use the fact that ice is generating tags to kind of slow down the runner and propel the corpse tempo forward. It was a meta call on the idea that it was going to be pretty good against reg runners who weren't quite aware of the threats yet. I think this deck used a very cheeky Starlit Knight, a card that people had rated quite lowly in the previous season, and leveraged it pretty effectively here. There was also a little bit of early explorations in R+ as a spam, though that deck wouldn't really come out until later in the event. A week later in Cascadia, in Seattle, the North American Continentals held at an event named Cascadia took place. Hoshiko made up a third of the field, so gaining another 10-ish%, and then Arasana and Tau combined made up another third, and then Sable took another 10%. So 419 had diminished immensely. Sable had actually taken up some of that gas, about half of it, and Shaper, despite not putting up, had put up some results at APAC, but with a little bit more time with people to look at the Shaper tools, I think people were excited to kind of bring these tools to bear. I think everyone knew the meta wasn't quite solved, and having an extra week to think about how to build a Shaper deck, a thing that no one had practice on because Shaper wasn't a faction for many years, made people a little bit more bold. But Hoshiko on her own was the most prolific, almost made up the most prolific thing. And then corpse side, we saw a lot of R+, outfit, and Epiphany. R+ and outfit both making up about 18%, and then Epiphany and Asa both making up about an eighth of the field, so 12%. So corpse were kind of more split up, but you go from sports metal effectively disappears, and we actually won't see any more sports metal do anything in the competitive scene for the rest of the year. But we'll see R+ and outfit, these kind of scrappy decks that look to, in outfit's case, leverage bad pub to surge forward and then score out with regulatory captures and other fast advanced tools, and these scrappy R+ lists that look to defend agendas and artificial crypto crashes behind just a little bit of gear check ice that hurts the runner more than they can get through early, as kind of the leading factors. But I think what happened in the Cascadia cut was really interesting. So the cut was still pretty Hoshiko heavy. It actually had a slight improvement, 37% of the field. But Shaper actually took an equal proportion, split between both Lat and Arasana. The Arasana deck that was brought by me and Joe didn't end up sticking around as a major meta consideration. However, the Reg Lat deck that Encoder brought, also known as Cody brought, was going to be one of the like basically foundational decks that people had to think about when thinking about the meta. It wasn't always the most popular, but I think it was actually a great answer to a lot of the later evolutions that we would see in the Corp meta. Corp side, though, a lot of really interesting things happened. Rongi Doge won the event with a deck that would come to be known as Table Carnage. This is a NEH deck that played Reaper Function, SIU, End of the Line as a combo to kill the runner. This was the deck that actually used Wage Workers most effectively in this meta. And this deck just used an absurd amount of tempo between Wage Workers, NEH, and federal fundraising to swamp the runners in tempo. I think one thing that was really interesting about this deck was people saw it and said, how does it win? Then they saw it win. They said, there's no way that beats runners who know what it's doing. Then it beat runners who knew what it's doing in the cut. To quote Sanjay in the chat, okay, it won in the cut, but then what? Then people said, okay, it's a gimmick deck. It will be figured out. Spoiler alert, it would not be figured out. It was one of the best decks in Worlds in a few months. I think another thing that I do want to shout out is a deck that I brought, which is this kind of triple Mavirus op list that scores aggressively and powers its early and mid game off of the back of Tucana. Rush Ob had been an archetype that existed before, and I think I'm not going to claim to be the only person who realized that Tucana was a good card in op, but this was the first competitive result where Op really showed that it could hang with the big boys and be a meta consideration. Mahoshiko made a really solid appearance in the event overall, being one of the leading decks. And Hermes Hoshiko ended up winning the event overall. But all of these Hoshiko decks use DreamNet, which is a card that we will come to soon. Now, interestingly, EMEA again happens 1 week after all of this, and the field is again different. So it's now 28% Hoshiko, 20% Arasana, and 12% Sable. So Lat's popularity went way down. Arasana's popularity goes, up. Hoshiko's popularity actually goes a little bit. Well, no, it goes up. It's down from like the cut conversion. So we're still seeing Hoshiko eat more and more of the overall runner pie. And then the Corp side is a very, very different split. So we've got 17% outfit, 17% op. So over a third of the field is playing Wayland, which is a pretty, that's a thing that very rarely happens in competitive Netrunner. Then we see 11% ASA, R+, and then a little bit of Ag Infusion, at about 8%. And so this is like a really different field. Across these three events, we've gone from having a lot of 419 to a lot of Shaper, with Hoshiko still eating a bunch of the pie. And Corps have basically been different at every event. In the first event, it was a lot of sports metal. Then there was a lot of kind of R+ and kind of Epiphany, kind of Acid yellow decks, and then by EMEA we're like suddenly all Wayland or Asa, and the cut at EMEA was a ton of Skunk Void out of HB, and so this was played out of both Asa for Saka, who won the whole event. It was also played in PD for decks that did very well, and the EMEA event was a very, very large event. I think it was the largest Continentals that's ever happened. And I think it's, one of the things that is sort of interesting about the Automata Initiative, right, is that the decks that were playing Skunk Void didn't get many new tools, but were able to make it work. And we're going to see PD continue, in particular the PD Skunk Void decks, to be a very core part of the meta. I do want to give a quick shout out to Kalikana Zoo. That wasn't called this yet, but it was. This is the first kind of presence of that archetype where the idea is that, we can use calibration testing to score. I did a whole video about that with Jackmade. You can check that out on my channel if you want to know more about it. In terms of the runner side, EMA didn't have very much, actually looked pretty similar. Reg Host just looked very, very good. And despite being not very popular, like this Reg Lat deck, which I think the author called Congress Lat as a reference to some very old Netrunner decks, kind of actually did really well. And we also see Rotom Appliance come in with Twinning Sable, which is a deck that's going to become really important in just a few months at Worlds. I also want to give a shout out to Frog Off Keeling because I'm a big Arasana stan, and this less engine-focused Arasana was going to become the like more competitively consistent one that we would see throughout the season. While Skunk Void HB ended up winning the event and making up most of the 4 of the top 5, it wasn't the deck that people actually spent the most time talking about and having discourse on after the event happened. That ended up being Ag Infusion, in particular Vientine Keeling Ag Infusion. This deck would use either Energetic Void or Cold Sight Server combined with Ag Infusion's ID ability to make it nearly impossible for the runner to contest Vientine Keelings in an appropriate manner that didn't break their back, so they wouldn't just lose to the next one. This deck ends up not winning any major events, but taking up a huge amount of airspace. I even did a full stream night, and I think I played against some. It was like a whole topic of discussion. You can see some of that in old VODs, where we just struggled to beat it with basically any consistency, unless we included a ton of tech, and even then that only brought the matchup to a 50-50. Then we get to Intercontinentals. Intercontinentals always has a bit of a weirder vibe, at least from my understanding of what people bring. A lot of people will bring their pet decks over maybe what the best deck is, but in this case, that meant that 75% of the field brought Hoshiko. Ultimately, the event was won by Man of the Moon's kind of asset kill, grinder-ish EOB, and this grinder style of asset op would continue to be a major meta consideration. It would, in fact, I think, mostly have a higher, it would win or top more events than the kind of fast rushing op that I spend so much time talking about. But another thing to shout out here is that Table Carnage, still not called that yet because Ian is not Cable Carnage, came in second. So even in a field full of some of the most elite players, the deck was still working. Once again, Ag Infusion didn't do that well, but it was only brought by a single player, but it was still becoming part of the discourse in a big way. And so coming out of Intercontinentals, there was a couple of clear problems in the meta. People have been calling for a Hoshiko ban since before the Automata Initiative released, and now with her taking up 75% of the field and winning all 3 Continentals, there would clearly something had to change. Now, I think, even before this changed, I think the meta was in a really interesting spot where there wasn't a clear best deck. We had actually that's not quite true. I think kind of a Reg Hoshiko was a clearly strong deck that no one else found something quite as good at. The Keeling Reaper Ag Infusion or Keeling Ag Infusion deck was very clearly quite strong, but there were several other strong and interesting corp archetypes that could be played around with. Then the 2309 ban list dropped in time so that Worlds could have its own, a brand new ban list. It was effectively 2 bans and 1 unban. So DreamNet, a card that was a high number of includes in Hoshiko and a low include in some other decks. The DreamNet ban was meant to just slow down Hoshiko specifically. And I think many people, myself included, were somewhat skeptical that this was going to move us away from Hoshiko is the only runner meta. The Keeling ban was basically just saying, yep, this Ag Infusion deck is gross, let's get rid of it. The other thing that would happen would be that Lamb would be unbanned. This is a card that had been banned through some interaction with some really old cards. You can see Andre's ban list video, I think, where he talks about Lamb and what interactions were there. There was a few smaller events between the ban list and Worlds. In particular, there was an Australian Nationals, which I'm not really going to talk about, other than saying that, once again, Skunk Void Asa did quite well. Runners were still heavily Anarch, but Essa suddenly showed up as one of the meta decks. And then we get to Worlds 2023. Now, often what happens in Worlds events is that testing teams will hold their decks back in secret, show them up to Worlds and say, look what we found, this is the best thing in the format. And I think what's really cool is while that did happen, I think every testing group came to their own conclusions, and I don't think Worlds brought any clear answers as to what the best decks were. There were a lot of different theories about what people would be good. A lot of people were expecting that Red Hoshiko would continue to be clearly the best runner, but I think that's not quite what happened. So at Worlds, a third of the runner field was Hoshiko, 16% was Sable, 15% was Essa, 12% was Ari on the runner side. So we still see a huge dominance of Hoshiko, but now Sable and Essa are eclipsing Shaper's popularity. And then the corpse side was 15% Asa, 14% PD. These are the corps that had done really well at the most recent largest event, the European Continentals. 13% OB, 12% Outfit, and 10% R+. So, you know, everyone's kind of bringing the stuff that had won previously and giving it a shot. But then what happens when you get to the top cut, the top 16, 37% of the top 16 were Sable. So the Sable basically was twice as likely to make it into the cut as would be expected. Hoshiko converted about as much would be expected, and Essa overperformed very slightly as well. So Sable, Hoshiko, and Essa now suddenly seem like the core tenants. And then when you look at the corpse side, a quarter of the corp was NEH. Now this actually was made up of two different archetypes. There was both the Table Carnage, where now Table Carnage would bring it to second place at Worlds, as well as this deck called Cannel, or this deck was also done in R+. So these were, again, the Cannel and Cannel Plus decks were more designed on tempo-based tagging strategies, where they weren't trying to kill, they were trying to score out, fast advance, econ denial, like the kind of more classic NBN style strategies. There was also a decent showing for OB and PD in the top 16, but Asa was nowhere to be found, and Outfit also had a good couple of showings as well. So for the top of Swiss, there was two spots in the top 16 that were an archetype that people were aware of, but it kind of thought were pretty cheesy. These were Bacterial Programming, Your Digital Life, Punitive Jinteki decks. At Worlds 2016, they were played out of Restoring Humanity. We will see that these show up again out of Ag Infusion later in the season. We also see a couple varieties of Ob. So we did see some Stavka Hafren, also sometimes called Stavron Ob. We saw a Mad Combo Ob, which is a deck that I have been playing in the prior rotation. And we also saw this Facet Ob, which is a sort of fast advance asset-based Ob list. And then runner side, we saw two different types of Sables show up, both a Twinning Sable and a Deep Dive Sable. I think the Twinning Sable proved to be the more robust archetype and the one that would continue to be explored as the season progressed. But the Twinning Sable was enabled largely by Hermes, and it's kind of, you know, the Twinning Sable deck doesn't run very many of the Automata Initiative cards, but it wouldn't exist without Hermes, I think, in a really meaningful way. We similarly see Twinning Hoshiko continue to be quite strong, but, you know, not clearly the best deck, or at least not in the same way as it was before. We also see the very first Mulch deck, which I'll talk about more later, a couple of Essa decks, and then Extract bringing this reg-ish Arasana list we had talked about earlier, and we'll see it again at UK Nats. But Worlds was actually won by a fairly different deck. It was won by Saga, bringing Built to Last. He was one of the few people that brought Built to Last to the whole event, but he won his second championship using now Built to Last. The idea behind this deck is it was really going to be punishing for the Reg Hoshiko decks and also the Reg Criminal decks that, you know, he was expecting. Reg Criminal was maybe not at the forefront of everyone's mind, but it was definitely on the forefront of some of the elite testing groups, and I think Saka was planning for beating those. And so the idea behind this Built to Last deck is it would slowly build up this inevitable board state, and through rig shooting and advancing clearinghouses in the remote, it could just make the game utterly unfair for the runner in some way, shape, or form. his runner deck was a deck that he would continue to play for the entire season, though there would not be so many people using this style of Hoshiko list either before or after, which is this kind of just boomerang Hoshiko. It's just Bankar, boomerang, fundamentals, kind of win through skill and reading the board state. And that is a very strong and very viable archetype, but it's not one that, everyone used. And we see, Hoshiko decks that leaned more on other aspects of the Anarch toolkit throughout the year. So Worlds happens in October, and we have this meta that seems to be saying, okay, you should be playing Twinning Sable, you should be playing Twinning Hoshiko, you can maybe play some other stuff if you like to, and Corpse side looks like you should be playing, some version of NEH as a spam, or if you want to counterattack these Sables or these Twinning decks, maybe you can look at something like Sokka's BTL. And we get the October AMT. This is the largest accelerated meta test. This is a 40-person event, and it is almost 50% Hoshiko with only a smattering of other decks. And it's a Corpse smorgasbord where no single Corp deck is super popular, but there's just showings from everything. And this was an event where Mulch started to actually gain real momentum. So there was a ton of interest in Mulch kind of in the discourse, but I think people were saying, oh, only one Mulch deck made the top 16. These other decks are really good. But these Mulch decks, which is this deck that's driven by this engine of Audrey, Strike Fun, Steel Skin, and Knobkery and Imp, would prove to be one of the most powerful forces as the meta started to develop even more. The corps that made the top 3 for this were a Punitive Restoring Humanity, a Big Deal PD, and Facet Ob. So we get this sense of very, very different metas, right? The top 2 decks from Worlds were nowhere to be seen in this top cut of this October AMT. And so, again, we're 2 events out. Meta is not really clear. We go to UK Nats just a couple weeks later after Worlds. UK Nats is a large 90-person event, and last year UK Nats happened after Worlds, and that event had a very different meta than the Worlds meta that happened the month before. What had happened in 2022 was that Worlds was a lot about endurance out of Hoshiko, endurance out of Lat against Sports Metal or this Ag Infusion Prison deck. And then when UK Nats rolled around, it was oh, somehow all of the top cut was 419 versus R+. And once again, UK Nats seemed to have the same pattern where, Worlds was a lot about scoring decks and aggressive runners playing Twinning, and suddenly R+, specifically the Candle variations of R+, took over the event. Amani Sinai and B1001 were key pieces that kind of took the deck from being really good, or from being interesting, to suddenly a real terror. But despite being a big part of the discourse, a huge part of the top 8, the event was won by PD and Sable, played by Rotom Appliance, coming off of his World Championship a few years prior, playing, while not actually the same decks, I think in spirit, some of the same decks. For UK Nats, the Swiss breakdown was 30% Hoshiko, 18% Sable, and 13% Essa. So, not as much Hoshiko as we had seen at the October AMT, and, numbers that kind of resembled Worlds in terms of the runner side breakdown. But the Swiss breakdown for Corpse was very different. Now suddenly a quarter of the field was NBN, either as Reality Plus or NEH. 15% was PD, 10% was Ob, 9% was Outfit, and then there was kind of this other smorgasbord. And NBN cleaned up, taking 5 of the top 8 spots. But there were some other kind of interesting rogue decks that showed up. So 2 calibration testing Obs made the top 8. And then for Shapers, it wasn't a total wash. We had Grug Brain Kit, which was a, sort of a again, sort of going back to a fundamentals runner, but a very funky fundamentals where they were playing Spark of Inspiration and big decoders to kind of control the tempo and pacing of the corps who were on scoring plans. And Extract showed up once again with Metric Octopus to give Arasana some shine towards the back half of the competitive season. So, you know, it was really interesting being in the meta at the time of UK Nats, because the UK players were saying, we have found the evolution of the format just like we did last year. It is these R+ decks that swamp the runner and tags. It used to be hard-hitting news. It's now Oppo research. But, you know, the meta is solved. This is what it is. And I think what's really interesting is at the same time, QTM in particular, but also I want to say Doomrat, kind of started racking up showings with this mulch deck. This, I think, initially was actually because they had these amazing matchups into these R+ these R+ Cannel decks. Because it turns out that the Cannel decks were really enabled by being able to hold some punishment in hand and getting to threat 3 very quickly by even just advancing a Bologna naked on the table, because the runner would have to steal it and fall behind in tempo, or give up a Bologna and still let the corp do Oppo research in future turns. But when suddenly there are 2 different decks that are planning to run Imp and use it as soon as turn 1 or 2, well, suddenly that Bologna can be imped off the table, and the worst that can happen is 2 tags off of an Oppo research. And for the Table Carnage decks, suddenly they can no longer hold their end of the lines in hand. And so there started being real problems for these kill and tag-based NBN strategies. And so, you know, World's meta had been a lot about these twinning decks for the runner side and how those shaped the corp. Then Corps had taken the lead, shaping the meta by saying you have to play around tags. And now once again, Corps had taken control with these mulch and Lou mulch decks to kind of shape the meta again. So UK Nats happens in November. We have a quiet December, and then we have the New Year's Showdown. And once again, the Swiss makeup changes a lot. So, you know, UK Nats had been almost a quarter Reality Plus, and then it moved to about a quarter PD and about 17% Reality Plus, 10% OB, and 4% Asmari. In particular, Hoshiko fell a little bit in popularity, and Lou kind of gobbled up a lot of that popularity. So Lou, who had been basically a non-presence in any previous event, suddenly was almost as popular as the most popular runner ID. We also see Reg Lat making a big appearance, making up a whole 1/8 of the field, outpacing both Sable and Zaya at 10% each. But again, the top cut looks very different from the Swiss breakdown. So this is just an interesting year where people bring what they like, what is popular, and then the cut as a way of dodging on everyone's expectations. We get the cut just dominated by PD. 5 of the top 8 were PDs, with then 1 person each on Asa, NEH, and Asmari. I believe the NEH was another Cannel variant. And then the cut was actually a majority Lou, and then equal parts Sable Hoshiko, and then a lone Zaya making the top 8. And so Mulch ended up taking a huge percent of the runner share. Half of the decks in the top 8 were Mulch style decks, these Audrey, Imp, you know, Strike Fund engines. But Sable and Zaya also did really well at this event. So, you know, we're in this interesting situation where some people, so QTM and Doomrat and a bunch of other people have like done work innovating and refining this really complex and highly tuned runner engine. And then people can also just do really well playing good old fundamentals Netrunner. And some of this is probably because as people were playing against these mulch decks, they started realizing that some of the best counters to them were PD, or were these kind of Glacier Asmari lists, these lists that could go install protect both centrals turn 1 and still have a coherent plan on how they would win the game. And so we start having this counterbalancing of forces that again we had, you know, is I think what can make metagames really lively and dynamic and quite interesting. And then we get to the final event of the Automata Initiative meta, the Circuit Breaker Invitational. And once again, the meta looks different. So this is something like, across the like 10 or so of different events I've covered, I don't think any Swiss breakdown has looked that much like the previous one, and no cut breakdown has looked like any of the previous ones. In the Swiss, we see a large portion of PD, of op, and then surprisingly as Mari and outfit, we see almost none of the kind of R plus or NEH style lists, I think because people were anticipating so much mulch. We see Hoshiko swing back up and Lu go back down. We see Essa actually more popular than Lu, despite not really showing up at the event just a week before. And in the cut, we see 2 mulch Hoshikos, 2 reg Hoshikos, 2 Lus, an Essa, and a Lat. And the cut is 38% op, 25% as Mari, with a Ag Infusion, an R+, and a Mirror Morph. And I think one of the things that I still don't know about this is PD completely disappeared. Now, there's a couple of different explanations. One might just be they got unlucky. I think the format for the CBI ended up really pushing a lot of luck into the situation. But let's be a little bit more serious. Like, it also might be that Mulch figured out how to play the PD matchups more with a little bit more practice. On the corp side, though, we did see some really interesting stuff where there was at least 3 different archetypes of op in the top cut. And this is the first major event that's been won by an op deck. We had the Tucana op, we had the kind of mental boost grinder op, and the event was won by Grudge Work, which is something of a slight variation. I'm going to call it on grinder, though I think there's more nuance to it than that. And it's also, I think I want to give a shout out to Augustus, who came second at the New Year's Showdown, and then also second the Circuit Breaker Invitational, switching from PD to Punitive Ag Infusion. I wanted to give this another shout out. It had done well at Worlds. It had mostly disappeared and then shows back up to kind of cap off the season with a second place finish, which I think is even more impressive when you think about the fact that he did this in a meta where many of the runners were just imping the agendas out of his hand. So, after this whole thing, we've had, 7 months of competitive Netrunner. We have had some of the largest events of the Null Signal Games era, and definitely the largest in-person events of the Null Signal Game era. So where do we stand on the meta? I genuinely don't know if I could tell you what the best deck in the meta is for either side right now. And I think that's an incredibly cool thing to say. I think very clearly this Audrey discard engine is one of the strongest runner decks in the meta, but I don't think it has a clear winning matchup against every reasonable corp. These Glacier and Rush, PD and Asmari pose a lot of challenges to it. And, while I don't think we've seen it bear out as much, I think the Rush obs, and we've seen the Facet and Grinder obs, can have really good matchups into these Audrey decks. At the same time, there are runners that can just scrape by against some of those decks with the Twinning engines and the Hermes engines and Hoshiko and Sable and Lat. Those have all been able to push the meta. And we've seen in some of the events I can't really cover after the Circuit Breaker Invitational, some more ambushy and trap style decks trying to exploit both the reg runners and the mulch decks at the same time. And so ultimately, I think one of the reasons I come down on this meta being one of the best of all time, if not the best of, the best of the Null Signal Games era, is that not only is this meta diverse, but basically every faction has had a deck that has been the best in the meta for a point of time, and only one of those factions needed cards that would be banned. And player preference and player skill is playing a huge role in what you want to bring and how well you can do with it. So with all that said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the meta. What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? What did I miss for the next time I go and do one of these meta recap videos that you would have really liked to have me talk about some more? And with all that said, I really hope you enjoyed this recap of the Automata Initiative competitive season and are looking forward with me to the next competitive season, starting with the very soon release of Rebellion Without Rehearsal.